If you were born in the Middle Ages, the very first thing you had to do was survive childhood, and that alone was a battle. To modern ears, the idea that life expectancy in medieval Europe hovered around 30 or 35 years may seem shocking, almost impossible. It almost sounds like everyone simply dropped dead as soon as they hit 30. But the truth is far more complex and far darker. Life wasn't short because people aged faster. It was short because death waited everywhere. In the air, in the water, in the food, in the streets, even in the bed beside you. Survival wasn't normal. Survival was luck. From the very moment a child entered the world, the odds were already against them. Childbirth itself was one of the most dangerous experiences in human life. There were no sterile rooms, no antibiotics, no trained surgeons, no emergency care. A mother laboured in a smoky wooden house, often surrounded by midwives using cloths washed in cold river water, water that likely carried bacteria. If something went wrong, there was nothing anyone could do. A breech birth, an infection, excessive bleeding, any of these could mean death within hours. Many women never even lived to see their children grow, and many children never lived long enough to remember their mothers. In some villages, nearly half of all babies died before the age of 5. Imagine a street where every second child simply disappears. That was normal. Parents often delayed naming newborns or grew hesitant to show affection because they knew how fragile life was. A simple fever could take a baby in days. Diarrhea from contaminated water could dehydrate them to death. A cough in winter could turn into pneumonia with no cure. Childhood was not a protected stage of life. It was survived. But even if you survived childhood, life offered no respite. The medieval world was, above all else, filthy. Not because people didn't care about cleanliness, but because they didn't understand germs. Disease came from invisible microbes that no one knew existed. Cities filled with waste. Streets doubled as sewers. People dumped chamber pots from windows. Animal manure mixed with rain and mud until entire towns smelled like rot. Rats scurried freely, spreading fleas that carried plague and other diseases. Water, which should have been life, was often the agent of death. Wells dug close to waste pits, rivers carrying both drinking water and sewage. One sip could carry deadly parasites. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, these were invisible assassins, capable of killing within days. Food could not be counted on either. Modern supermarkets, freezers, and global imports make us forget how fragile medieval food supply was. One failed harvest could spell disaster. There was no storage technology to preserve crops for months, no refrigeration, no imports from distant lands. Grain rotted quickly, livestock died in harsh winters, and entire villages could starve. Hunger was slow and relentless. Thin faces, weak muscles, brittle bodies. Malnutrition compounded the risk of disease. A body starved of nutrients could not fight even a minor infection. The difference between survival and death often came down to what ended up on your plate that day, and whether there was any plate at all. And then there were the plagues. Nothing symbolises medieval death more than the Black Death. Arriving in Europe in the mid-14th century, the bubonic plague reduced life expectancy almost overnight. Fleas carried by rats spread Yersinia pestis, causing swelling, fever, delirium, and death within days. Entire families vanished, streets filled with carts carrying bodies, Priests, overwhelmed, sometimes stopped performing funerals. In cities like Florence and London, half the population perished. It didn't matter if you were a peasant or a noble. Even castles were not immune. And because no one understood how disease spread, human behavior often made it worse. People gathered to pray, fled towns, or handled the dead without protection, amplifying the outbreak. Even outside of plague years, death was constant. Minor injuries could kill. If a farmer nicked a hand with a scythe, infection could enter the bloodstream. Cuts, scrapes, burns, even toothaches, any minor ailment could turn fatal without antibiotics. Surgery was crude, done without anesthesia, often in unsanitary conditions. Bloodletting, leeches, and herbal concoctions were common remedies, sometimes helping by accident, more often harming. Childbirth remained a deadly risk for women throughout their lives. Repeated pregnancies took a toll, and obstetric complications often killed both mother and child. Work itself was hazardous. Most people were peasants, labouring from sunrise to sunset, often performing back-breaking tasks. Fields had sharp tools, heavy carts, and unpredictable animals. Accidents were routine. Without hospitals or compensation, injuries were frequently fatal. Winter added another layer of danger. Homes were poorly insulated, fires smoked more than they warmed, blankets were thin, and hypothermia was a real threat. Families sometimes huddled with animals for warmth. Illnesses spread easily in such close quarters, and respiratory infections were common. Urban life brought its own dangers. Cities were overcrowded, filthy, and teeming with vermin. Streets reeked of waste, the air carried the stench of uncollected garbage, and epidemics moved quickly through tight quarters. Smallpox, measles, and influenza could decimate entire neighbourhoods. Wealth offered some protection: larger homes, private wells, access to better food, but no immunity. Even kings and nobles were not safe from epidemics or sudden disease. Violence was everywhere. Bandits roamed countryside roads. Lords waged feuds over land and honour, dragging peasants into their conflicts. Soldiers returned from battle wounded, spreading infection. Villages could be burned overnight. Life was fragile. Security was a constant worry. Laws were enforced inconsistently, and punishment for minor offences could be brutal, sometimes lethal. Justice was arbitrary, leaving survival partly a matter of social standing and luck. Yet, despite all this, people lived. They laughed, fell in love, told stories, celebrated festivals. Even surrounded by death, life pressed stubbornly forward. Humans adapted. They endured. They survived in a world that seemed determined to erase them. Those who lived past childhood, avoided plague, and survived injury or famine often grew into adults capable of working, reproducing, and passing on resilience. Their survival was the result of a combination of skill, resourcefulness, and sheer fortune. This is why life expectancy figures from the Middle Ages can be misleading. Saying the average life expectancy was 30 or 35 years does not mean everyone died young. Many who survived childhood lived into their 50s or 60s. But the extremely high mortality rate among infants and young children skewed the average dramatically. The statistic reflects more the danger of early life than the inevitability of dying at 30. Interestingly, social class could make a difference, but not enough to ensure long life. Nobles and wealthy merchants had better nutrition, more protection from harsh labour, and sometimes access to rudimentary medical care. But they still faced disease, plague, childbirth complications, and violence. For peasants, survival was a daily struggle, often involving long hours of back-breaking labour, minimal food, exposure to the elements, and constant risk of infection. A minor injury could spiral into death. A small fever could be fatal. A winter without sufficient firewood could kill entire families. Survival was fragile, and life hung by a thread. The medieval world was also a place of psychological strain. Grief and loss were constant companions. Children lost siblings. Parents lost children. Families were forced to cope with death as an everyday fact. Communities celebrated births, marriages, and festivals, yet under that surface was the knowledge that anyone could vanish suddenly. Life was lived with a kind of resigned awareness. Every day could be the last, and survival was never guaranteed. Food scarcity, disease, environmental hardships, and violence created a society in which resilience was essential. People learned to ration food, forage wild plants, store salted meat, and survive winters with minimal resources. Communities helped each other in times of famine or epidemic, though even cooperation could not prevent widespread death. Folk remedies, herbs, and local knowledge were often the only medical support available, passed down through generations, sometimes effective, sometimes not. The combination of ignorance, lack of technology, and harsh natural conditions made survival an ongoing challenge. By understanding medieval life in all its complexity, from childbirth and childhood to work, famine, and disease, it becomes clear why life expectancy was so low. It wasn't a matter of genetics or weakness. It was a matter of environment, circumstance, and constant exposure to hazards. Death was a normal part of existence, not an anomaly. And yet, humans endured. They laughed, loved, and built communities despite everything stacked against them. They farmed, fought, traded, prayed, and created, leaving a legacy that we still study today.